film Nightshift follows a girl named Jen on her first day of work at a laundromat, during which an unseen demon begins to torture her. This entity is meant to symbolize a growing obsession for work and how it can take over a person's life, willingly or not. So when you're looking at our film opening, there should be an obvious theme of isolation and the overall feeling that the character is being stalked. The main character is alone in almost all shots except for one, the one in which Jen's manager is handing her the keys. Though she is not technically alone in this shot, the way the figures are blocked creates the idea that they are separated and cannot connect on a basic human level. Notice that there is a literal physical barrier between the characters, meant to symbolize the emotional barriers created by a consuming obsession for work. Even the space in which the manager is in surrounds him on all sides except for the one that the camera's on. It's as if he's trapped in a cage, unable to leave until his duties at the place of work are relinquished to Jen. Blocking was a key component in creating the meaning of the film and showing Jen's increasing commitment to her job, like in the shot of her loading the dryer, where the dryers fill the frame much like her job will continue to fill her life. Most horror films do not establish the main characters isolated in the very beginning of the film, and instead tend to pick off characters one by one until we are left with a lone survivor. We opted to establish a personal relationship with the sole character and the audience from the very start, instead of introducing a bunch of characters and having their fates mean very little to the viewer. At points in our opening, we put the camera in very high or awkward angles, which is a common convention found in supernatural horrors. This is meant to put the perspective into that of the monsters. We're supposed to be stalking and watching the character. She's not speaking to us or acknowledging us in any way. She's completely engulfed by her work, and an easy target. When Jen first walks into the laundromat, the camera is viewing her entrance from a very high angle, almost peering over the edge of a set of washers, as if we're watching her, but we don't want her to know. Adding camera movement was a very important step in creating perspective, because if it were still the whole time, it would not feel as much like a character. A lot of slasher horrors tend to put the perspective into that of the killers, as to keep their identity unknown and add suspense. For us, it was not necessarily about hiding the identity at all, as most supernatural horrors do not show the monster anyway. We use this convention to add meaning and an emotional attachment between the audience and the character. When I think of films that really inspired this use of perspective, it would definitely be classics like Scream, Nightmare on Elm Street, and Friday the 13th. Though our film is not really a slasher and more in the realm of supernatural horror, it does include a lot of inspiration from and qualities of a slasher film. For props, they really just acted to establish the setting and give motion to our actress, but the open sign did play an important role in the meaning of the scene, and is definitely my favorite shot. When the sign flickers off, it is to signal not only that the entity is closing the store, but it's closing Jen off from the rest of the world, isolating her to her work. It's metaphorical, and in combination with the slow buzzing, it creates a great visual impact for the end of the scene, leaving the viewer to wonder what will happen next, something that almost all films in this genre attempt to do. As far as lighting goes, we went with a mix of both very high-key exposed lighting in the main part of the laundromat, and very low-key dark lighting everywhere else. In the beginning of the film, she's walking into her first day of a new job, and is in the dark about what she should expect. Therefore, she's in the dark on-screen as well. When she arrives, she should be vulnerable and exposed to the monster. Therefore, the high-key lighting. Another reason we chose to film this at night was because it's a very common trope in horror films that bad things always happen at night. The flickering light was another commonly used aspect found in horror, and was meant to add suspense and uneasiness to the viewer, showing that things are starting to go awry. For costuming, we went with very subdued colors that matched the surrounding setting, to show that she's a piece of the laundromat now. Also, uniforms suggest conformity, and that she's owned by the job, unable to express herself freely while working there. A lot of films in this genre will dress the victim in bright colors that stand out, but we felt it would take away meaning from our opening. Editing for our film followed a pretty typical format found in the beginning of horror, starting by establishing location and using a slow pace to create a false sense of calm, as well as build the anticipation. Where we really broke the mold was the sound editing. The choice to include a voiceover instead of the character talking or some kind of musical score was an unusual one. We felt it would set the scene much better and establish a needed background to the plot of the film, so that the viewer was not left clueless as to what to expect. The sting right before it cuts to the open sign was a stylistic choice, meant to add suspense and surprise the audience. This is a convention used in supernatural horror films to keep the audience interested without actually introducing any major plot advances. The titles we tried to keep as short and sweet as possible by only including the necessary credits required to roll an industry-standard film. Everyone who worked in our group was mentioned and got their due recognition without overpowering the frame. We didn't want to use a basic Arial font and instead went for something more visually appealing. At the very end of the opening, we chose to display our film's title on a black screen so that it would break the tension of the scene. We also wanted our title to have a specific score that can be associated with it, and created a sound on a laptop so that it would be completely original to our film, and could be something people remember when they think of Nightshift. A lot of movies in the horror genre use this technique, most famously Jaws and Psycho. The final girl trope is very overused in horror films, stemming from the emasculating nature of slasher films from the 80s and 90s, which started to show men as weak and women as hypermasculine. It was used as almost a type of satire. As film and time has progressed, the girl is typically presented as a ditzy, vulnerable party girl. Being white and blonde doesn't hurt either. This character will survive till the end plainly on the will of the monster or the killer, and not based on any particular skill of her own. With supernatural horrors, the final girl is also put into play when you think of movies like It Follows, for example. I wanted to take a slightly different approach with this film. We did use a young female as our lead, but instead of portraying her in this helpless light, we wanted her to put up a genuine fight, because in the end, this is a film about an emotional battle within the character. The biggest inspiration for this main character was the Babadook, which portrays a woman who battles the monster in a genuine and symbolically emotional way. We also wanted to challenge some representations of race in horror and film in general. Typically, the non-white character is killed off first in the horror film, sometimes portrayed as the funny one, and not to be taken seriously in the grand scheme of things. We opted to put our non-white character in a position of authority, something that is rarely shown in film as a whole. At first, we thought about using crowdfunding sites like Kickstarter to source the funding for our film, but realized that using a production company would be a much more traditional route and would give our film a foot in the door in terms of distribution. While researching companies to produce our film, we've considered using a few different options like Benderspeak, but realized that if we are going to use a production company at all, it needs to be one that can specialize in very low-budget horror. Blumhouse had a track record of successful low-budget horror films like Saw and Paranormal Activity, so it seemed meant to be. We would also want to have a distribution company that has experience in marketing horror films. Paramount was our first choice. Our main route for exhibition will be Amazon and Netflix due to the ease and convenience for viewers. People are more likely to binge a small-scale horror film in the comfort of their own home rather than viewing it in a theater. We still do want to have it display in some theaters around the country so that it can qualify for any possible awards in case the audience reception is good enough. Our target audience is teenagers of all genders, as we hope it will show women in a stronger role than is typical of horror. I also feel that it's something parents should watch as well, because we want the message to hit home, that you shouldn't let your job isolate you from the important things in life. When I started this class, I had no idea what went into producing a film at all. The idea of cinematic invisibility really blew my mind and allowed me to think about ways in which I could use setting, blocking, camera movement, editing, all of it, to present my ideas and really make an entertaining product. I knew that to make a film you needed to have an idea and a plot, but I didn't know all the planning that went into it. I was mainly in charge of designing the look and feel of our film and planning out how shots would create meaning. This meant I had to do a lot of research into how opening scenes typically look in horror films and how much they reveal about the storyline, which is why I drew so much inspiration from various other films. Storyboarding was something I never really heard of, and didn't find all that important until the actual day of filming, when I could look back on a piece of paper and know exactly what my vision was, and how it should be portrayed on the camera. Not only did it make my job as director and actress easier, but it allowed me to have more control over the scene and how it created meaning. We drew up a lot of different storyboards before deciding on one that suited our vision the best. For shooting, I learned that you have to take away more shots than you actually need, sometimes the same one but changed in very minimal ways. When we first started shooting, we left with a lot of footage we couldn't use due to blur or shakiness, and actually had to reshoot a fair amount. It was definitely a learning experience, and in the future we know to always check all footage before you leave the set or location. We ended up with so much extra footage we didn't actually incorporate into the film. When it came time to edit and film Foley sound, I learned just how much those additional sounds can add to the film and create a realistic atmosphere. Little things like the coin dropping into the dryer slot added so much realism to the film that I originally thought just came naturally. Of course, this also took a lot of trial and error to get all those signs lined up just right, especially while recording and editing the voiceover. We had to record and re-record so many times and ended up editing some of the recordings together and adding breaks to get the final result. To make our project, we used a lot of different devices, each for different functions. We had 2 cameras, one being the Nikon Coolpix P500 to record shots involving zoom. This camera was smaller and easier to maneuver, so it was used in the beginning shot of Jen turning the car off, as well as the whip pan from the fan to the over-the-shoulder of Jen. That shot took so many attempts as we couldn't use anything to stabilize the camera, so we just had to get it perfect on our own. That really showed us how much technology affects the end result, as shots with Steadicam and tripods were so much less shaky and easier to look at. It's also a consumer-grade camera, so it's not really meant for this type of filming. The majority of the film was shot on a Canon 60 with a 24mm lens. We used a wide-angle lens to add a spacious effect and make the main character look even more alone in the frame. This lens meant that we could not zoom in, and it was a much bulkier item as a whole due to the Steadicam attached to it, which looked great in tracking shots. The image is much cleaner on this camera as well. As for the sound recording, we used a USB Blue Snowball microphone. This had settings for both omnidirectional sound, which we used to record ambient sound of the TV and washers, and localized sound, which we used when recording sounds like that of the open sign and the voiceover. When we first started recording Foley sound, we started with the sound of cars going by, and had trouble figuring out whether to use omnidirectional or localized sound. The localized sound version is what we ended up using in the final cut. As far as editing goes, all of it was done on Premiere Pro, and we did end up doing some color correcting over the final edit to add a blue tinge to the entire sequence. This was mainly to add an unnatural feel to the film and make the viewer uneasy, as well as just making the shots more visually appealing.